The fluorescent lights of the supermarket hummed like tired bees, washing the aisles in a cold brightness that seemed to notice no one. Shoppers pushed carts with restless hands, their shoes scraping against the polished floor, their eyes impatient for the day to end. Yet in the middle of that noise and light, one figure seemed to move in slow motion, as though the weight of her world pressed against her every step. Eleanor Vance held a cracked leather wallet in her trembling hands, the faded stitching cutting into her fingers, as if reminding her that survival had become her only companion. At 27, her shoulders had already learned to carry burdens far heavier than her years. And tonight, the burden was a single blue can of baby formula. Her daughter Daisy was just a year old, with a nose like a tiny button and eyes bright as summer skies. To Eleanor, Daisy was not only a child, but a living prayer, the proof that love could still bloom even in soil hardened by loss and loneliness. Yet the doctor's instructions had been unyielding. This expensive formula was the only kind her fragile stomach could take. Eleanor had promised herself she would always make it work, skip meals, add shifts, tighten belts. But promises are sometimes broken not by lack of love, but by the sharp blade of reality. And as the cashier's voice announced the total, her heart stumbled into silence. The formula cost more than the cash folded in her palm. She had counted and recounted, hoping a coupon had slipped between pages, hoping the numbers would shrink under her desperate gaze. But numbers do not bend to hope. With shame burning across her cheeks, she whispered the words no mother should ever whisper. "I need to put this one back." The store carried on, indifferent, as if her quiet defeat were nothing more than static in the air. Behind her, carts rattled, voices sighed. To them she was another nameless struggle in a line that never ends. But what Eleanor didn't see was the man standing a few yards away, pretending to browse a row of apple juices. He was tall, wrapped in a grey coat of understated wealth, his dark eyes steady, yet shadowed by something deeper than exhaustion. His name was James Caldwell, though no one there knew he had built empires out of sparks of genius, nor that his fortune stretched farther than the shelves of the megamart ever could. What mattered in that moment was the way he was watching. He saw the tremor in her hand as she slid the can across the counter. He saw how her eyes refused to lift, as though looking into anyone's gaze might break her apart. He saw a quiet dignity disguised beneath shame, a fire banked but not extinguished. And in his chest stirred something he had long forgotten, the ache of compassion, the healing warmth of simply noticing another soul. His daughter Sophia, small fingers curled around his hand, tugged at him softly. "Daddy, why does that lady look so sad?" The question was as gentle as falling rain, and it pierced him. How could he explain to a child born into a palace of plenty that some mothers had to choose between their own hunger and their baby's comfort? How could he explain that love sometimes knelt powerless before the price of a barcode? He only whispered, "She's having a hard day, sweetheart." But inside, he knew the truth was heavier. Eleanor left with a single plastic bag clutched like a fragile secret. She walked with the posture of someone who wished the ground would open and swallow her away, her shadow stretching thin against the glass doors as they slid shut behind her. She was a ghost in a place alive with noise, and James, a man who could summon fleets with a signature, felt his pulse quicken with certainty. He would not let her vanish into that night. When he followed her to the far edge of the parking lot, the air was sharp with early winter. She sat on a bus stop bench, her hair loose, her gaze lost in the dark horizon. He approached carefully, holding the can of formula in a bag, along with bread, fruit, and a box of cookies his daughter loved. "I think you forgot this," he said gently. She startled, her pride flashing in her eyes like broken glass. "I didn't forget. I couldn't afford it." "I know," he replied, voice low, steady, carrying no judgment, only the calm resonance of truth. "That's why I bought it for you." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Acts of kindness had always seemed like fairy tales told to someone else, never meant for her. Her pride battled against her love for Daisy. But pride is fragile when measured against the healing need of a child. Tears blurred her vision as she accepted the bag. "Thank you," she whispered. He only smiled, as if to say that gratitude was unnecessary. The bus headlights were still far away. The night around them stretched like an ocean of quiet. James gestured to his waiting car, sleek and silent, with a driver holding the door. She resisted, shaking her head, but his voice was gentle and unyielding. "Please, let me take you home. It's no trouble." His hand brushed hers when he lifted her grocery bag, a fleeting contact that sent warmth spiraling through her arm. For the first time, she looked at him not as a stranger, but as a man, with eyes tired from battles invisible, a sadness lingering behind wealth's polished mask. In the car, Sophia greeted Eleanor with the innocence only a child carries. The ride passed in quiet rhythm, filled with the soft laughter of father and daughter playing I Spy, their bond weaving a comfort Eleanor had not felt in years. When the car stopped before her worn apartment building, shame flickered again at the cracks in the walls, at the peeling paint. Yet James carried her bags without hesitation, his footsteps steady behind hers, his presence warm in the cold stairwell. When Daisy's joyful cry echoed from the playpen, the world shifted. Eleanor gathered her daughter into her arms, all fear dissolving in that small miracle's embrace. James stood in the doorway, watching the simple apartment glow with love stronger than luxury. In his chest, something stirred again. Hope, unfamiliar and healing, like a forgotten melody remembered at last. He left into the night, but the story did not end at the stairwell. For Eleanor, a new ember burned within, fragile yet alive. For James, loneliness had cracked just enough to let light in. Neither knew then that a single act of kindness in a grocery store would entwine their lives like roots seeking the same soil, binding past and future in ways neither could have imagined. And as you breathe with this story, let it remind you of the healing power of small gestures, of noticing the unseen. If this moment touched your heart, if it soothed even a shadow of loneliness inside you, I invite you gently. Leave a like, share a comment about where this story found you, and subscribe so these warm tales can reach you again. Every gesture of support is not just energy for me to continue, but a thread that ties us together, reader and storyteller, heart to heart. The night of the supermarket was not an ending. It was a beginning, and as the bus rolled past without her, Eleanor stepped into something far greater than she could have dreamed, a path not of despair, but of healing, grace, and the first quiet breath of love. The days that followed carried a softness Eleanor had not felt in years. as though the heavy fog that had wrapped around her life had thinned just enough to let light breathe through. Each morning she woke to Daisy's laughter, and even the sound of the kettle boiling in her cramped kitchen felt less like routine and more like a quiet song of survival. On the counter, the blue can of formula stood like a beacon, a reminder of an evening that had shifted something deep inside her. It wasn't just milk for her daughter. It was proof that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and chosen to help. That gesture became a healing thread she wrapped around her weary spirit. At night, when Daisy was tucked into her crib, Eleanor would sit in the silence of her apartment with a pen in hand. She began to write. Not letters she would send, but words that spilled out of her like water from a long, dry spring. She wrote about her great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael Vance, whose faded photograph still kept watch from the bookshelf. She wrote about the way her mother used to say, "We are made to endure, Eleanor. Endure, and life will bend." And she wrote about the stranger in the grey coat, the way his eyes had held kindness without pity, strength without arrogance. She never expected to see him again, yet her hand trembled as though she were already shaping his name into her future. One morning, as she prepared Daisy's breakfast, she unfolded the newspaper left by her neighbour. The classified section stared back at her, lines of ink promising jobs that always seemed to demand more than she could give. Yet something tugged at her gaze, an administrative position at a community centre that served veterans and their families. The pay was modest, but steadier than tips from the diner. And the name of the place, Veterans Community Centre, echoed with something that felt like belonging. She circled it, heart beating with cautious hope. The following days blurred into preparation. She ironed her only interview blouse, smoothed the creases as if smoothing the wrinkles of her life. She borrowed her neighbour's mirror and practiced smiles that looked too shy, then too forced, until finally she let them fade and chose honesty instead. Daisy gurgled beside her, clapping at every gesture, a small audience of love. On the morning of the interview, Eleanor kissed her daughter's forehead and whispered a promise. "Everything I do is for you, my light." The community centre was humble, walls lined with sepia photographs of men and women in uniform, their eyes steady with the weight of sacrifice. Eleanor sat before Mrs. Gable, the director whose warmth softened her nerves. They spoke of her skills, her longing for stability, her deep respect for service. For a moment, Eleanor felt possibility blooming, fragile but alive. And then Mrs. Gable, with a regretful sigh, explained the position had already been filled. The disappointment pressed against Eleanor's chest like a stone. She stood to leave, murmuring thanks, her hope folding in on itself. But before she could step away, Mrs. Gable slid a paper across the desk, her eyes gleaming with something close to excitement. "Another opportunity has opened," she said. "The Vance Legacy Grant." Eleanor froze. Her own name was there, bold and impossible. A grant created to honor descendants of local war heroes, offering not only financial support but education, training, and the dignity of a true chance. Her heart pounded as though her great-grandfather himself stood behind her, reminding her of courage. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Yes." That night, Daisy played with wooden blocks on the rug, while Eleanor sat at her small desk, papers spread before her. The grant meant she could breathe again. She could dream again. For once, survival was not the end of the road. It was the beginning. The apartment felt lighter, its cracks and shadows softened by the glow of hope. She wrote a letter of thanks addressed only to the anonymous benefactor, her words carrying gratitude so deep it seemed to shine from the ink itself. She imagined an elderly man, perhaps a veteran, someone who wanted to honor the past by healing the present. She never guessed the truth, that the stranger from the grocery store had woven himself quietly into her fate. Far across the city, James Caldwell sat at his wide glass desk, but his mind was not on contracts or numbers. The image of Eleanor's face haunted him. Not the despair of that supermarket night, but the quiet strength she carried even when bowed by life. When his head of security placed a folder before him, revealing her lineage, the name Vance struck him like thunder. His grandfather's stories rushed back, a battle long forgotten, a sergeant who had saved lives with fearless resolve. And suddenly, helping Eleanor was no longer an accident of compassion. It was a thread of destiny, a legacy demanding to be honored. James spent evenings watching his daughter draw rainbows in her coloring book, while inside he wrestled with loneliness sharpened by wealth. His wife had passed years earlier, leaving a silence no luxury could fill. He looked at Sophia's curls, at her innocent joy, and thought of Eleanor's Daisy, thought of the way Eleanor's eyes had softened when she spoke her daughter's name. He longed for connection, not gilded by fortune, but rooted in something real, something healing. And though he remained hidden, his heart had already begun to turn toward her. Weeks later, Eleanor moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment in a quieter neighborhood, sunlight spilling through the windows in the morning. Daisy toddled across the small patch of grass behind the building, her laughter rising like a bell. At night, Eleanor poured herself strong coffee and studied for her online business courses, her determination fierce, her exhaustion softened by hope. She imagined the benefactor far away, never realizing his gaze often drifted toward the same stars above her window. When the invitation came for her to speak at the reception launching the grant, her stomach knotted with fear. Public speaking had always been her shadow, a place where words tangled and voices failed. But this was her chance to thank the one who had lifted her into possibility. She bought a simple dress from a clearance rack, smoothed the fabric, and told herself courage was not about being unafraid. It was about choosing to speak, even when the fear trembled in her bones. The night of the reception, she stepped into the hall filled with tables and soft music, feeling every eye heavy upon her. And then, across the room, she saw him. The man from the grocery store, the grey coat replaced with a dark, tailored suit, but the same eyes, warm and steady. Recognition struck her like lightning, shock, wonder, a flutter of something she dared not name. He smiled, slow and gentle, and in that smile she felt seen all over again. In that instant, the world began to shift once more. Eleanor felt the room tilt, the music thinning into a hush that existed only between the two of them. James's smile held steady, warmer up close, softer than it looked across a room full of strangers. He crossed the floor with the calm certainty of someone moving towards something he had already chosen. When he reached her, the noise of conversation and clinking glasses returned like a tide, but it didn't touch them. It seemed to break at their feet and turn away. "Hello," he said, voice low, the single word carrying the memory of a grocery store aisle and a winter night where kindness had changed the air. "Hello," she answered, breath catching on the edge of relief and disbelief. She could feel her pulse in her wrists, in the small hollow of her throat, in the quiet place where fear used to live. Now it was something else. Anticipation, bright and trembling. A healing warmth she hadn't known she could keep. They stood at the fringe of the crowd, where the light gentled at the walls. Up close, she saw the faint lines of fatigue around his eyes, but also a clear steadiness, as if he had been practicing being strong in solitude. She thought of him lifting the bag into her hands at the bus stop, of the way he hadn't tried to make her small with sympathy. He had offered dignity, and it had tasted like water to a thirsty soul. "You're here," she said, and then realized how thin the words were compared to the truth under them. "So are you," he replied, and the hint of amusement in his eyes made the moment feel less impossible and more like the next step in a path they had been walking without knowing. Before either of them could say more, Mrs. Gable swept toward them, flushed with the glow of a successful evening. "Eleanor," she said, clasping both of Eleanor's hands. "You look lovely. I'm so glad you're here. And Mr. Caldwell, thank you for coming." She turned to Eleanor, eyes bright with meaning. "This is the man you'll want to thank most." Eleanor's breath thinned. She looked back at James, and the room blurred at the edges. "You," she whispered, not accusation, not even surprise, just the dawning recognition of a pattern drawn by invisible hands. "It's you." His smile didn't widen, but it deepened. "Let's get a little air," he suggested, his voice a quiet harbor. He guided her through a side door to a small patio where the night held its breath and stars wavered in the thin cold. City sounds drifted like a distant river. The door settled shut, and the hum of the reception became a memory. For a moment they said nothing. The silence felt gentle, a soft cloth over something delicate and true. Eleanor pressed her fingertips to the metal railing, cool against her skin. He stood beside her with his hands in his pockets, gazing into the clear dark, as if weighing how much truth would fit between them without breaking. "My grandfather kept a journal," he said at last. He wrote about a man who saved his life, a sergeant with steady eyes and a voice that could hold fear still. He turned to her then. "Michael Vance." Her name in his mouth always sounded like a decision, and hearing her great-grandfather's name there too was like a blessing. The little ache she always felt when she looked at the old photograph expanded and eased at once. "My mother told me pieces," she said. "Stories that felt too brave to be real. He died before I was born. Sometimes I thought I made him bigger in my head than he could have been." James shook his head. If anything, the stories were smaller than the man. He watched her carefully, not to see if she would break, but to make sure the truth landed where it could be held. "When I learned who you were, it didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like a thread finally being pulled through." Eleanor's eyes stung. The night air settled in her lungs and loosened something that had sat there for years. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "Not the supermarket, not the grant, none of it." "I know," he answered, "but I wanted to, not out of charity, out of gratitude, out of respect, and—" He paused, searching for a word that wouldn't be too much to carry in a single breath. "Out of hope." She didn't look away. "For what?" "For a world where we aren't just numbers and headlines, where a debt of honor is more than history, where two people can meet under bad lights with tired hearts and walk away with something living. His mouth quirked, almost a smile. And for the selfish possibility that doing the right thing might let me feel human again. The softness in his confession touched her more deeply than any polished speech could have. She had long ago learned to move quietly around other people's sorrow, but his loneliness had been an open window on the night he drove her home, and now it was a room they could both step into. "You do," she said. "You feel human." He laughed softly. "Tonight I do." They stood together under the small square of sky, and Eleanor felt a strange, sweet peace. The truth hadn't taken anything from her. It had given her back a story she'd been carrying alone. His presence didn't crowd her. It made more space inside her chest, more room for breath. The healing was not loud. It was a slow sifting, a gentle rearranging of weight, so that what had once been heavy now felt like something she could lift. The door swung open. A woman's voice rang like crystal, clear, cold, practiced. "James, there you are." She stepped onto the patio in a sheath of winter white, her smile just a shade too bright. "They're starting the speeches. Everyone's waiting." James's posture didn't change, but the air around him tightened. "Penelope," he said, "we'll be in shortly. This is Eleanor Vance." Penelope's gaze flicked over Eleanor, pausing at the clearance rack dress with a glance as sharp as a paper cut. "Ms.
Vance," she said, the syllables a polite frost. "I've heard you'll be speaking. How meaningful." Eleanor gave a small nod that held. She had been bent so many times by the world's little humiliations that she'd learned how to stand even when the ground beneath her was not kind. She did not apologize for existing. James's hand, still in his pocket, curled as if to close around air. "Penelope," he said mildly, "I'll be in after Eleanor's remarks." The woman's smile tightened in the way that meant a power calculation had not added up. "Of course," she said. "I'll let them know you're delayed." She left behind a faint perfume and a cooler temperature. Eleanor exhaled, the breath fogging in the light. "She doesn't like me." "She doesn't like anything she can't catalogue," he said. "You don't fit her labels." "I don't fit most," she almost smiled. "It's all right. I'm learning to be my own shape." For a heartbeat, he looked at her with an expression so unguarded it felt like an intimate light. "I'm glad." Inside, a microphone squealed and then calmed. Someone tapped it twice, and the sound bounced along the hall. Eleanor's name rose and hovered. Her stomach fluttered, but not with dread. With the clear, clean energy that comes just before stepping onto a new road. She turned to the door. He reached out, not to hold her back, but to place his hand lightly at her elbow for a single moment, the kind of touch that says, "I'm here without demanding anything in return." "You'll be wonderful," he said. Her answering breath was an agreement. The room brightened as she walked in, though the lights had not changed. Faces turned, some expectant, some indifferent, some kindly curious. She moved toward the small stage, as if climbing a hill she knew. The notes she had written and rewritten waited in her purse like a script for somebody else. She left them there. When she reached the microphone, she kept her hands loose at her sides and let the quiet be a bridge rather than a gap. "I didn't plan to stand here," she began, voice steady, intimate, the kind that invites people to lean closer. "I planned to disappear, to be one more person you pass at the store and forget.
but someone looked at me, and instead of pity, I was given the dignity of being seen. That changed the way I looked at myself. She spoke about nights of counting coins and mornings with Daisy's laughter like sunlight through thin curtains. She spoke about the photograph on her shelf, Michael Vance, young and grave and stubbornly alive in grainy black and white, and how the stories of his courage had carried her when the ground seemed to be made of water. She spoke about the grant, not as a windfall, but as a doorway built where there had been a wall. And she said thank you, not as a ritual, but as an offering that belonged to both the giver and the receiver. As she talked, the room shifted. People aren't used to hearing truth presented without polish, without the spine-straightening shine of accomplishment. But tenderness has its own authority. The applause when she finished rose not like a storm, but like a wave with a long, clean line, inevitable, honest, warm. She stepped down. James stood, not clapping harder than anyone else, not making a spectacle of his approval, but the look on his face was its own ovation, pride without ownership, joy without demand. She could breathe inside it. Penelope's eyes glittered from a table near the centre, mouth closed in a tight orchid of a smile. Behind the expression, calculations were happening like a flock turning in the sky. Eleanor felt nothing move inside her in response. No shame, no panic, only a calm awareness that not everyone would walk with her. Some would stand in the road to watch, and some would build fences along the edges. None of that changed the road. The rest of the evening passed in a gentle blur. Handshakes from strangers whose hands were suddenly not so strange. A veteran with a cane telling her in a thin, bright voice about Michael Vance pulling him out of a ditch under fire. A woman with grey hair clasping Eleanor's fingers between both of hers and whispering, "You made me remember my husband tonight." The gratitude she received settled into her like a soft quilt, not heavy, just present, a newly warm thing. Later, after speeches and toasts and the small murmurs of departure, James waited by the double doors, coat over his arm. The hall's lights had dimmed to a tender gold. "May I take you home?" he asked, as if the question were the simplest extension of that winter night, and also as if it were the politest thing a man could ask a woman he did not want to burden. "Yes," she said, because the word was true and gentle and right. The car's cabin was warm and quiet. The city slid by in lit lengths like ribbon. She thought of Daisy sleeping in the careful care of her neighbour, of the tiny chest rising and falling with the serenity of a child who trusts the world. James's driver took the long way through a street where plane trees arched overhead and made a cathedral out of ordinary air. They didn't fill the silence with small talk. They let it be what it was, a space big enough for two histories to sit down side by side and rest. "Do you ever feel," she said after a while, "that grief is not something that leaves, but something that learns to walk beside you?" He nodded once, eyes on the road beyond the windshield. "Every day." His voice had the soft, worn place of truth. "But sometimes it holds your hand instead of your throat." She looked at him then, light skimming his profile, and felt tenderness uncoil inside her like a long-guarded animal discovering a meadow. "I'm glad you understand." They reached her building. He stepped out to open her door, from courtesy, not habit. Cold met them like a familiar. He carried nothing, reached for nothing, and yet it felt as though he were helping her with all the weight she no longer had to lift by herself. At the stairwell, he didn't follow. He stopped at the base, one hand on the banister. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, James." She didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because gratitude had already woven itself through everything. Saying the word again would be like naming the air. She climbed, keys whispering in her hand. At her door, she glanced back. He was still there, a dark shape in the dim, head tipped as if listening to an old song. He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a small, boyish salute, and the gesture made something under her ribs glow. Then he turned and left. Inside, Daisy slept, cheeks pink, mouth slightly open. Eleanor touched the smooth space between the child's eyebrows with a kiss, and felt her heart fold itself into the shape of home. At the kitchen table, she opened her notebook and wrote, without effort, without strain. The words came like warm rain. "Tonight I learned that legacy can be a bridge, not a burden. Tonight I learned that kindness can be the beginning of courage. Tonight I learned that the world might bend after all, not because we force it, but because 2 people decide to stand in a place where it needs to soften." She slept and dreamed of blue light that didn't hurt. Morning brought small rituals, the kettle, the window opening to cold air, Daisy's triumphant announcement of bird at the sill. Days stacked themselves into a rhythm that felt less like endurance and more like a song she chose to sing. With the grant funds steady and classes unfolding in crisp, purposeful lines, she could plan, she could imagine. She began to see rooms that hadn't existed before. A desk where she might work without looking at the clock as if it were a hunting cat. A calendar that held more than obligations. A future with a gentle shape. James found himself rearranging the furniture of his days. Meetings that once felt inevitable began to seem negotiable. He walked more. He said no to rooms in which his soul felt small. Each afternoon he made time to be home when Sophia returned from school, her backpack banging against her legs like a drum. They made tea together. She told him secrets that were really just feelings needing a place to sit. He told her exactly as much about his day as she wanted, no more, no less, and felt the humility of being guided by a 5-year-old's questions. On a quiet Wednesday, he drove across town with a box of old things from his grandfather's trunk. A journal, a letter never mailed, the photograph of a squad with faces too young and eyes too old. He didn't intend to see Eleanor. He only intended to be near the center for a while, as if proximity could be a kind of prayer. He sat in the car until the impulse to intrude passed. When he finally went inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon and floor polish. A volunteer traced a finger over names etched into a plaque and smiled at him without recognition. He stood before the display case that held a folded flag and a single battered canteen. Gratitude gathered in him like tide water. Eleanor arrived unexpectedly, cheeks pink from the weather. Daisy bouncing on her hip, a messenger bag slung across her shoulder. She stopped when she saw him, surprise brightening into something almost playful. "You came." "I did," he said, and the understatement wrapped itself around the truth like a scarf around a warm throat. Daisy reached toward him with that fearless belonging toddlers give to kind eyes. He took her carefully, the way a man learns when he has learned too late. She explored the buttons of his coat with solemn concentration. then patted his cheek as if acknowledging a job well done. Something in his chest eased in a way that felt both new and remembered. Sophia, he thought suddenly, would like this child. The realization felt like a door opening onto a sunlit room. They walked the small museum together, reading captions quietly, letting silence do most of the speaking. He showed her the journal, held it open like a shared candle. She touched the page without touching it, her hand hovering above the faded lines as if heat might rise from the words. Her eyes shone. She did not cry. She stood very still inside a tenderness that had been waiting years for a moment like this. After, they sat on a bench near the window while Daisy fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder. Outside, winter light washed the sidewalk in a pale sheen. "There's a board review next month," he said carefully, not to burden her, but because truth wanted clear air. "They want to formalize the grants selection process. It's sensible. But there will be politics." She nodded. There are always politics when money is near. She tilted her head, a wry, gentle acceptance. "Will it be difficult?" "It might," he said. "Penelope is persuasive. Precision without tenderness can sound like virtue." "I have tenderness," she said softly. "And I have precision when my child's future is in the math." He smiled. "I've noticed." "I don't want to be the reason anything falls apart," she said. "But I won't be the excuse either. I wouldn't let you be." The promise wasn't a vow he could fail. It was a posture he had already taken. They parted with the ease of people whose lives were beginning to braid not by design, but by repeated choosing. He didn't kiss her. He didn't even touch her hand. He simply looked at her as if they were reading the same page in a book neither wanted to rush, the kind of story that knows how to breathe. The weeks bent toward that board meeting with the quiet momentum of a train you can feel before you hear. Whispers rose and settled. Penelope appeared in hallways and vanished, leaving behind phrases about governance and optics like little glass shards that glinted just enough to cut. Eleanor kept studying, kept folding laundry warm from the dryer, kept learning the names of the security guards who held open the heavy doors at her building. She kept being a mother, which is to say, she kept being a world. On a Sunday morning, James brought Sophia to the park near Eleanor's building. The children, meeting as if they had planned it in dreams, negotiated the hierarchy of the swings with the serious diplomacy of the very young. Daisy adored Sophia instantly, imitating the older girl's careful manners with earnest enthusiasm. Sophia, who had learned caution as a language from adults who didn't always know they were teaching it, melted into laughter she saved for the safest of hours. Eleanor and James watched from a bench. Sunlight came through bare branches like mercy. "Sometimes," Eleanor said, "I think the most healing thing is watching them play. It proves the world knows how to be simple." "It helps," he agreed. He glanced sideways at her. "You help." She did not flinch from the words. "You too." Sophia called, "Daddy, higher!" He pushed, steady, attentive. Daisy clapped both hands and shouted something that was probably, again, but sounded like music. On the day of the board meeting, the sky wore the flat grey that cities wear when they haven't yet decided whether to snow. Eleanor pinned back her hair and chose the same blue dress she had worn at the reception. She placed a photograph of Sergeant Vance in her bag, not to show, but to hold. James waited in the corridor, posture relaxed, eyes alert, as if ready to step into weather without assuming it would be bad. When she reached him, something in his face eased. Seeing her had that effect now, the way arriving at a familiar doorway does when you've been walking far. Inside, the long table gleamed with polished intent. Penelope presided with a smile that belonged in a gallery, not a kitchen. She spoke first, with articulate frost, about best practices and stewardship, about process and perception. She did not say Eleanor's name, but she set it like a place card at the center of the table. A few heads nodded, a few faces closed. James listened until the room began to tilt. And then he stood. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deploy his wealth as argument. He opened a leather-bound book and read 2 lines his grandfather had written in a trench barely wide enough to forgive a body. The room changed shape. He placed the photograph beside the book and did not push it forward. He let the distance be the measure others would choose to cross. Eleanor stood, hands steady. "My name is Eleanor Vance," she said, but the words meant, "I am not a rumor." She spoke about dignity, about doors that open because someone decides to build them, about the cost of suspicion when it multiplies against the poor. She did not defend herself. She defended the families not in the room, the children who would grow taller because a pantry did not echo, the mothers who would sleep because the rent was possible. She said the grant should be larger, not smaller. She said oversight was love when done right. She said she would help write the process if they wished. Silence held a long breath. The first board member to speak was an older man with a hearing aid he fiddled with more than he used. "This sounds right," he said simply, as if reciting weather. Penelope recalculated, her eyes moving as if following birds the rest of them couldn't see. Her smile dimmed by a what. "Very well," she said. "Let's vote." They voted. The grant stood, not as an exception, but as a pillar. The process would be built with care and clarity, with Eleanor's pen at the table. When it was finished, Penelope excused herself with perfect manners that felt like a glass door closing. In the corridor outside, relief rose and swooped like a flock startled and then settling. James looked at Eleanor as if the day had put something right that had once sat crooked on a shelf. "You were—" he began, then stopped, choosing the good word. "Right." "I was simply honest," she said. "Sometimes that's the bravest thing," he answered. She smiled, and the tiredness that went everywhere with her didn't go away, but it glowed as if lit from within by meaning. He reached for her hand, finally, not to claim, not to guide, but to learn its weight. She let him, and the touch felt like a prayer said correctly for the first time. They walked out into air that might yet snow, their breath clouding and blending. Somewhere inside the building, people stacked papers and plugged in chargers and scheduled the next meeting. Somewhere else, 2 little girls compared pine cones as if they were jewels. The city made its everyday noises, kind and indifferent. The future did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived like this: 2 people stepping from a doorway to a sidewalk, shoulders aligned, warmed by a promise they hadn't spoken and didn't need to, already moving, already learning how to travel together toward whatever waited around the quiet, shining bend. Winter folded itself around the city with a quiet persistence, the kind that softened edges and slowed footsteps. Eleanor had learned to love this season for its strange clarity. The air felt cleaner, sharper, as though the world had decided to remind her that breath was precious. Nights no longer carried the heavy dread of loneliness they once did. Instead, they hummed with possibility, warmed by the memory of a man whose presence seemed to stitch together the torn places of her life. The weeks after the board meeting unfolded with a rhythm that surprised her. She found herself standing taller, not out of defiance, but out of a newfound ease. The rumor that had tried to reduce her to pity had dissolved in the light of truth, and in its place was a steady current of respect. When she walked into the community center now, people greeted her with warmth, not just because of the grant, but because she had spoken with a voice that carried healing, not anger. She hadn't expected admiration, she had only wanted dignity, yet what grew around her felt like belonging. James moved in his own orbit, yet their paths curved together with a naturalness that neither tried to resist. His work remained demanding, but he rearranged it with a quiet discipline, carving out evenings that belonged not to boardrooms, but to moments of laughter with Sophia, and more, to shared dinners where Eleanor and Daisy joined them. It started simply. Soup simmering in her small kitchen, or pizza boxes opened across his wide dining table, but the meals grew into rituals. Daisy's giggles filled the spaces that once echoed with silence, while Sophia's calm patience guided her younger companion with the grace of a sister. One evening, as the girls painted together at the table, Eleanor caught James watching them. His gaze wasn't distant or distracted, but anchored, soft with something that made her chest ache. It was the look of a man remembering what joy felt like. She smiled, and he returned it with a small, unguarded expression that spoke louder than words. Their closeness grew in increments, never rushed, never forced. They discovered the pleasure of small things, walking through a farmer's market on Saturday mornings, Sophia holding Daisy's hand with solemn pride, lingering at the park while the girls chased one another through piles of fallen leaves, sipping coffee in Eleanor's kitchen while Daisy napped, the quiet thick with unspoken tenderness. Each moment was ordinary and yet transformed by the awareness that it could have been otherwise, that loneliness could have remained, that hope could have withered, but it hadn't. And so each small joy became a healing gift. Still, the world did not pause for them. Penelope lingered at the edges, her silence sharper than her words had ever been. She no longer attacked openly, but her absence of warmth spoke volumes. James paid it little mind, though he noted the cold glances she cast Eleanor's way during community events. Eleanor, for her part, refused to shrink beneath them. She had weathered storms harsher than disdain. She carried scars invisible but strong, and she walked forward with quiet grace. Spring approached, and with it came changes Eleanor had scarcely dared to dream of. She was excelling in her business courses, late nights at her small desk illuminated not only by the glow of her laptop, but by the fire of purpose. Her grades were high, her confidence higher. One evening she confessed to James, almost shyly, that she dreamed of building something lasting, an organization that would expand opportunities for other single mothers, a place where dignity would be the foundation rather than an afterthought. He listened intently, the corners of his mouth lifting as though he had been waiting for her to say it aloud. "You already have the strength," he told her softly. "The rest is just structure." The words sank deep, not as flattery but as faith. For someone who had spent years unseen, to be regarded with such certainty was almost overwhelming, yet it settled inside her, warm and steady, a reminder that healing was not only about surviving the past, but about daring to step into the future. It was during one of those spring evenings, when the air carried both chill and promise, that their closeness reached a quiet threshold. The children had fallen asleep on the couch, Daisy's small hand tucked trustingly in Sophia's. The house was still, save for the gentle hum of the heater. James brought Eleanor a cup of tea, steam rising like a thin ribbon of comfort. "Thank you," she murmured, fingers brushing his as she accepted it. Their eyes lingered, and the silence between them deepened, not empty but full, rich with all the things neither had said. He stepped closer, carefully, as if giving her the chance to step away. She didn't.
The warmth of his hand found hers, and for a moment they simply stood, two people who had learned too well how to endure, finally learning how to rest. When he kissed her, it wasn't sudden or urgent. It was gentle, reverent, like a promise whispered against her skin. She let herself lean into it, not because she needed rescue, but because she had found a place where she didn't have to carry everything alone. The kiss was healing in its simplicity, emerging not of desperation but of recognition. When they pulled apart, her cheeks warmed, but her gaze held his steadily. "I wasn't expecting this," she said softly. "Neither was I," he admitted, voice low. "But I've been hoping for it." There was no rush to label what was unfolding, no demand to name it too soon. They let it be what it was, a love growing not from spectacle, but from small choices, repeated and true. The days that followed were gentler still. They continued their routines, building lives where the extraordinary hid in the ordinary. Yet beneath it all was a current of deepening intimacy, of trust that expanded like light. Eleanor felt it most when James held Daisy without hesitation, when Sophia leaned against her with the trust of a child who had decided she belonged. James felt it when Eleanor's laughter filled the spaces his late wife's silence had left, not replacing, but weaving alongside, honoring what had been while creating what could be. Summer neared, and with it came plans neither of them could have imagined in those first fragile moments at the supermarket. Eleanor's coursework was nearly complete, and opportunities began to appear. Speaking invitations, community partnerships, a chance to shape something lasting out of the pain she had endured. James, watching her rise with the steady grace of someone who had clawed her way through shadows, knew with certainty that what had begun as repayment of an old debt had grown into something far more enduring. Love, he realized, wasn't about rescue. It was about recognition. And as they stood together at the edge of the season, watching their daughters laugh in the sunlight, both of them knew this was no longer a story about survival. It was a story about building, about legacy, about healing that rippled outward, touching not only their own hearts, but the lives they were bound to change. The world around them moved, restless and indifferent, but within their circle there was warmth, steadiness, and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the simplest of gestures, a can of formula, a glance of compassion, a hand extended in the cold. And so the story continued, not in leaps but in steps, each one carrying them closer to a future stitched with love, resilience, and the kind of hope that heals not just two souls, but generations to come. The summer unfolded in colors Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. The days seemed longer,
not because of the sun's path, but because joy stretched the hours, weaving moments of laughter, of belonging, of simple presence. Daisy ran more confidently through the small garden of their new apartment, her curls catching the light, while Sophia followed close behind, protective and gentle. Their giggles created a kind of music, a healing sound that wrapped itself around Eleanor's heart and reminded her of how far she had come from the heavy silence of the grocery store that winter night. James often joined them, sometimes arriving with baskets of fruit or flowers, sometimes with nothing but his steady presence. He would kneel to tie Daisy's shoe or lift Sophia high into the air, and the children's delight would light his face with a softness that was rare in a man who had spent so many years carrying the solitude of wealth. Eleanor began to notice the changes in him, not grand shifts, but small gestures, the way he lingered over dinner, the way he looked at her as though she were not a struggle but a home. His loneliness seemed to melt away little by little, replaced by warmth that grew stronger with every shared hour. Their evenings became rituals. Sometimes they gathered in Eleanor's modest apartment, the scent of her cooking filling the space while James read to the girls in his calm, grounding voice. Other times they sat in his wide garden, candles flickering as the children fell asleep under soft blankets. On those nights, Eleanor and James spoke quietly, not always about the future, but about the things they had never dared tell anyone else. The grief he carried for his late wife, the fear she had lived with every day as a single mother scraping by, the dreams they both had thought were too fragile to name. In those conversations, healing became more than a word. It became the quiet mending of old wounds by the presence of someone who finally understood. One evening, as the cicadas hummed and the sky deepened into velvet, James reached for her hand across the table. His fingers were warm, steady, not demanding. She didn't pull away. Their silence was full, not empty, and when his thumb brushed the back of her hand, she felt her heart answer with a certainty she had been too afraid to trust before. She looked at him, really looked, and saw not a billionaire, not a benefactor, but a man who had chosen her not because she needed saving, but because he saw her strength and wanted to walk beside it. Her days took on a brightness she had never known. She woke early with Daisy, walked to the park, studied at her small desk, and discovered new resilience in herself. She began helping at the community center beyond her classes, volunteering time to speak with other single mothers who were where she had once been. She offered them not advice, but presence, the reminder that survival was not shameful and that healing could be possible. Every time she spoke, she felt her great-grandfather's courage echoing through her, grounding her voice in something larger than her own story. James supported her without overshadowing her. He attended her small talks at the center quietly, sitting at the back, his gaze steady with pride. When she faltered, glancing nervously at the crowd, she always found his eyes, and in them the reassurance that she could keep going. His faith in her became a mirror, reflecting a version of herself she was still learning to accept. But even as love grew between them, life did not pause. Whispers lingered around them. Penelope's quiet disapproval, the speculation of those who measured worth in wealth and status. Eleanor felt it sometimes, the way eyes lingered too long or conversations stopped when she entered a room. Yet she found herself less shaken by it. She had weathered the weight of humiliation at the checkout line, the sting of being unseen. Now she walked with a quiet strength, knowing that the truth of her life could not be reduced to gossip. James, too, faced pressures from his world. There were investors and partners who questioned his choices, who wondered why he was devoting so much of his resources to the grant, why he was spending so much of his time away from the empire he had built. But James had learned something through Eleanor's presence. Empires meant little if they did not hold warmth, if they did not carry love. And so he held his ground, balancing his duties with his growing devotion to this small circle of healing he had found. One late afternoon, they took the children to the shore. The ocean stretched wide, the air full of salt and freedom. Sophia built castles in the sand, while Daisy filled buckets with seashells, and James walked barefoot beside Eleanor along the water's edge. The waves lapped at their ankles, cool and insistent. "It feels different," Eleanor said softly, watching the children laugh. "What does?" he asked, his hand brushing against hers. "Life. It doesn't feel like waiting anymore. It feels like living." He nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting. "That's all I've wanted. For you. For them. For us." The word lingered in the air between them. Us. It was gentle, but it carried the weight of truth. She didn't reply, not with words, but her hand slipped into his, and together they walked along the shore, leaving two sets of footprints that wove into one path. As summer deepened, their love became less about gestures and more about presence. He was there when Daisy took her first confident run across the grass without stumbling. She was there when Sophia lost a tooth and grinned proudly at her reflection. They celebrated birthdays, small victories, even quiet mornings with pancakes and laughter. Their lives blended not in dramatic declarations, but in the steady weaving of days, each one adding a thread to the tapestry they were building. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, Eleanor and James sat together on her small balcony. The city lights shimmered below, and the night air was soft against their skin. James leaned back, his arm resting behind her chair. "I used to think legacy was about buildings and foundations," he said quietly, "about leaving something behind that people could point to." "And now?" she asked, her voice warm. "Now I think legacy is this," he said, looking at her. "Being here, watching them grow, loving you. It's not about what's left behind. It's about what we're living right now." Her heart swelled, and she reached for his hand. Their fingers intertwined, and for a long moment they simply sat in the quiet, breathing together, letting the healing warmth of love surround them. The months that followed were full of gentle milestones. Eleanor finishing her coursework with top honors, James bringing her to meetings not as a guest but as a partner, Daisy learning to speak new words, Sophia calling Eleanor not just Ms. Vance, but one day simply Eleanor with affection. The world still carried its shadows, but within their circle there was light, steady, and unyielding. When autumn came, the leaves turning gold and crimson, Eleanor realized she was no longer surviving. She was building a life, a family, a love that was steady and true. And as she looked across the dinner table at James, his eyes warm with quiet joy, she knew the story that had begun in the cold light of a supermarket had become something she could finally name. Love. Born not of rescue, but of recognition. Not of pity, but of partnership. Not of desperation, but of healing. It was the kind of love that would last, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, built day by day, moment by moment, in the gentle work of choosing each other again and again. And as the children laughed in the next room and the night wrapped around them like a blessing, Eleanor leaned closer to James, her heart full of gratitude, and let herself believe fully in the warmth of the future that awaited them. The autumn settled into a rhythm of gold and quiet winds, each day unfolding with a peace Eleanor had once thought impossible. The children grew together like sisters, Sophia steady and thoughtful, Daisy brimming with a restless joy, and their laughter filled both homes with a light that softened every corner. James watched them often, his gaze caught between pride and awe, as though these ordinary moments of crayons scattered across the floor or bedtime stories whispered in low voices were treasures more valuable than the numbers in his vast accounts. Eleanor had begun to see herself differently too. Her coursework was nearly finished, her evenings still filled with study, but now carrying the sweet certainty that she was working toward a future she had chosen. At the community center, she was no longer just a beneficiary. She had become a voice, a presence others trusted. Mothers who once looked only at the ground now lifted their eyes when she spoke, because her words carried not theory but truth. She remembered too well the pain of scraping by, of feeling invisible, and she used that memory as a bridge. Healing, she realized, wasn't just for herself. It spread, like warmth from a candle, touching others who dared step into its circle. James supported her, not with grand gestures, but with steadiness. He rearranged his schedule so he could attend her presentations, always sitting quietly at the back. His presence was her anchor. Whenever nerves threatened to fray her voice, she looked for him and found calm. He never tried to take her spotlight. He only made it brighter by believing in her. Their love grew in this way, unannounced, unhurried, woven into the ordinary days until it became part of the fabric of their lives. One evening, as the air turned crisp and the children slept in the next room, Eleanor and James sat on her balcony with mugs of tea. The city glowed beneath them, lights twinkling like a second sky. James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes reflecting the soft shimmer of the horizon. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said, his voice low, gentle. Eleanor set her mug down, waiting. "When I first met you, I thought I was giving something. I thought it was kindness." He looked at her then, and his expression softened. "But the truth is, you've given me more. You've given me back what I lost when Isabella passed, the sense that life is still alive, still warm. You've given me hope again." Her chest tightened with emotion, but it wasn't sorrow. It was gratitude, deep and healing. As she reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together in the quiet. "You've given me the same," she whispered. "You made me believe I could be more than survival. You gave me back the courage to dream." The silence after carried more weight than any vow. It was the silence of recognition, of love that didn't need declaring to exist. And yet, in that silence, something shifted. The boundaries of what they were, friends, companions, partners in hope, blurred into something deeper, undeniable. When he leaned in to kiss her, it was unhurried, tender, a meeting of hearts that had waited long enough. It was not about passion alone, but about healing, the gentle sealing of wounds both had carried. She melted into it, not out of need, but out of choice, and when they parted, her forehead rested against his. Neither spoke. Words would have been too small. As the weeks passed, their lives wove together more tightly. Eleanor finished her coursework with top marks, and James insisted on celebrating, though she laughed at the fuss. He hosted a small dinner at his home, inviting only a handful of close friends from the foundation. The girls decorated the table with hand-painted cards that read "Congratulations" in uneven letters, and the evening shimmered with warmth. Eleanor stood at the head of the table, humbled and glowing, and when she spoke, her voice trembled not with fear, but with joy. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, "but tonight I know for certain every hardship, every sacrifice led here, and I'm not finished yet." The applause was warm, genuine, but it was James's gaze that held her steady, his eyes shining with something only she could see. Winter approached again, but it no longer felt like a season of scarcity. It became a season of gathering. Their families blended seamlessly. Nights by the fire, mornings of pancakes and sticky fingers, afternoons of sledding in the snow. Daisy called Sophia her big sister without hesitation, and Sophia accepted the title with a quiet pride. Eleanor often found herself standing back, watching the four of them together, and her heart swelled with the healing knowledge that this family, this love, was real. Yet the world outside still pressed in with its whispers. Penelope's voice lingered at the edges of meetings, sharp with insinuations. But Eleanor no longer felt threatened. With James beside her, with her own strength blossoming, she faced the whispers with calm dignity. And when the board voted to expand the grant program, making it a permanent pillar of the community center, it was Eleanor they asked to lead it. She accepted, her heart full, her great-grandfather's legacy alive, not in plaques or statues, but in the healing work of her hands. On Christmas Eve, the snow fell thick and silent, covering the city in a soft white quilt. James invited Eleanor and Daisy to stay the night, not as guests, but as family. The house glowed with lights and evergreen garlands, laughter spilling from every room. After the children were asleep, Eleanor stood with James by the tree, the firelight flickering across their faces. "I used to think nights like this were only for other people," she said quietly, her hand brushing an ornament shaped like a star. "They were always meant for you, too," James replied, his voice steady with truth. He reached for her hand, and in that moment, under the glow of the lights, she felt the certainty of their bond. Not fleeting, not fragile, but lasting. Later, as they sat together by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, Eleanor leaned against him, her eyes half closed. The flames crackled softly, casting warmth into the room. "This feels like home," she murmured. His arm tightened around her. "It is home, and it always will be." In that quiet, Eleanor understood something she had never allowed herself to believe. She was not waiting for happiness anymore. She was living it. Healing had brought her here, love had rooted her here, and every breath carried the promise of tomorrow. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in peace. Inside, in the glow of firelight and love, their story moved forward, steady and sure, each moment a step deeper into the life they were building together, one marked not by wealth or grand gestures, but by the simple, unbreakable warmth of family, of love, of healing that would last through every season yet to come. Spring returned with a tenderness that seemed to echo the rhythm of their hearts. The city thawed beneath a gentler sun, and the gardens filled again with blossoms that coloured the air with fragrance and promise. Eleanor carried herself differently now, her steps lighter, her gaze steady. She had completed her studies and moved fully into her role at the Foundation, guiding the expansion of the Vance Legacy grant. The work was demanding, but it carried meaning in every hour, and that meaning nourished her more deeply than rest. James admired her in quiet ways. He would watch her speak at meetings, her voice calm yet strong, and he felt a quiet awe stir within him. She had risen from despair into leadership, not through anyone's charity, but through her own resilience. He thought of the first night he had seen her at the supermarket, her shoulders bent beneath invisible weight, and now he saw her standing before communities, radiant with dignity. He loved her not for the transformation itself, but for the courage she had carried through every stage of it. Their love unfolded with the same steadiness. There were no dramatic declarations, no spectacles to prove their devotion. Instead, there were mornings when James arrived at her apartment early to cook breakfast for Daisy and Sophia, laughter rising like sunlight as the children teased him for his clumsy pancake shapes. There were evenings when Eleanor read stories to both girls, her voice weaving comfort into their dreams, while James watched from the doorway, feeling the healing warmth of home take deeper root inside him. It was during one of these evenings, after the girls had drifted to sleep, that James finally spoke the words that had been growing in his chest. They sat together on the porch of his home, the air filled with the scent of lilacs, the stars scattering silver above them. He turned to her, his hand closing gently around hers. "I never thought I'd love again," he said quietly. "After Isabella, I thought that part of my life was closed. But with you, it doesn't feel like starting over. It feels like continuing, as though everything led me here." Her breath caught, but her eyes softened. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I'd find this either," she whispered. "Not after all the nights of counting coins, of wondering how to make it to the next day. But you've given me more than love. You've given me a place where I can breathe." The silence after was deep, filled with the quiet music of crickets and the distant hum of life. It was enough. Words were no longer needed to confirm what had already become unshakable between them. Summer followed with its long, golden evenings, and their lives blended further. They took the children on trips to the countryside, where fields rolled wide beneath blue skies, and the air smelled of wildflowers. Sophia and Daisy chased butterflies through tall grass, their laughter carrying across the hills, while Eleanor and James walked side by side, fingers entwined, hearts light. They picnicked beneath oak trees, the children napping on blankets while the two of them sat in companionable silence, simply watching the sunlight filter through leaves. The world, as always, had its storms. There were challenges at the Foundation, disputes among board members, moments when the weight of responsibility threatened to steal Eleanor's breath. But she faced them with grace, knowing she was no longer alone. James stood beside her, offering wisdom when needed, silence when not, and his steady presence became the anchor she could always return to. Together they found strength not in perfection, but in unity, their healing love weaving resilience into every challenge. It was in early autumn, on a day crisp with turning leaves, that James asked her to marry him. There was no grand gesture, no audience, only the intimacy of their shared life. He had taken her and the girls to a quiet lake, its surface glassy beneath the fading sun. While the children played at the water's edge, James knelt beside Eleanor on the wooden pier. "I don't want this life without you," he said, his voice low but certain. "Not just for me, not just for Sophia, but for all of us. You and Daisy, you are my home now. Will you marry me?" Tears filled her eyes, but they were not heavy. They were light, born of joy. She nodded, her voice trembling, yet sure. "Yes, 1,000 times. Yes." The children's laughter rang around them, and though they were too young to understand the depth of what had been spoken, they felt the joy, running to them with arms wide. Sophia hugged Eleanor tightly, Daisy clung to James's neck, and together they became a circle of love, strong and unbroken. Their wedding was simple, held in the garden of the community centre that had become the heart of so much change. Strings of lights hung from the trees, flowers lined the path, and the people whose lives had been touched by the grant gathered to witness. Eleanor wore a gown of soft ivory, her hair falling in gentle waves, while James stood waiting in a tailored suit, his eyes never leaving hers. When she walked toward him, Daisy toddling at her side and Sophia scattering petals ahead, it felt less like ceremony and more like destiny. They spoke their vows with voices steady, words rich with truth. James promised not wealth or comfort, but devotion, respect, and the daily choice of love. Eleanor promised not perfection, but partnership, courage, and the strength to keep building together. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause, but the moment belonged only to them, a sealing of two journeys into one, not erasing the past, but weaving it into a shared future. The reception was filled with warmth, children dancing, elders sharing stories, laughter rising into the night. At one point, James lifted his glass and spoke, not with flourish, but with heartfelt simplicity. "This began with a single act of kindness," he said, his gaze finding Eleanor's, "but it has grown into a life richer than I ever imagined. Love isn't about what we give or receive, it's about what we create together. And tonight, I know we've created something that will last." Eleanor's eyes shone, and she reached for his hand beneath the table. She knew it was true. The love they had built was not fragile, not fleeting. It was healing, it was steady, and it would carry them through every season yet to come. As the night wore on and the stars shimmered above, Eleanor looked around at the faces of those who had gathered, friends, families, strangers who had become community. She felt the presence of her great-grandfather, the courage of his legacy alive in the laughter and the hope that surrounded her. She felt the hand of destiny, gentle and sure, guiding her to this place where survival had turned to love, and love had turned to legacy. And as she leaned into James, his arm wrapped around her, she knew with quiet certainty that their story was only beginning, and that every chapter to come would be written with warmth, with grace, and with the healing power of love that had brought them here. The years that followed did not rush. They unfolded slowly, like the turning of seasons across a patient landscape. Eleanor and James built their life not with sudden strokes, but with quiet layers, each day adding another shade of color, another thread of strength. Their home became a place where warmth lingered in the air, where the scent of morning coffee blended with the sound of children's laughter, where healing had settled into every corner like light that refused to leave. Daisy grew quickly, her bright energy filling every room. She adored Sophia, who took her role as older sister with pride, guiding her through games and lessons, protecting her with a tenderness that came naturally. Together, they made the family whole, two hearts that had begun in separate worlds but had now found a rhythm like sisters, born of the same hope. James and Eleanor often watched them, their hands brushing as they stood side by side, their hearts swelling with gratitude that such ordinary miracles belonged to them. Eleanor's work flourished. The Vance legacy, Grant, expanded, touching families across the city, then across the state, becoming a lifeline for those who had carried burdens too heavy, too long. Each time a new mother stood at the podium to share how her life had changed, Eleanor felt her great-grandfather's courage alive again. She thought often of that photograph on her bookshelf, his eyes steady, his posture strong. His legacy had not ended in war. It had stretched forward, through her, through James, through every life lifted by their work. The healing of the past had become the foundation of the future. James changed too. The sharp edges of his loneliness softened until they were gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of a man who had found his home. He still carried the responsibilities of his empire, but now he balanced them with evenings spent teaching Daisy to ride her bicycle, or mornings when Sophia begged him for one more story before school. He no longer measured his days in contracts signed or deals won, but in smiles shared and quiet moments that glowed with meaning. His wealth was still vast, but his treasure was here, in this family, in this love. Their love itself deepened, maturing into something unshakable. There were no grand performances needed, no desperate clinging. It was a love that woke with them in the morning, stretched across the kitchen table during breakfast, and stayed with them as they folded laundry, as they planned their work, as they walked hand in hand through the garden. It was steady, healing, a constant presence that no storm could diminish. One spring evening, as the garden filled with blossoms and the girls played beneath the trees, James and Eleanor sat together on a bench. The air smelled of lilacs, and the sky was brushed with the first colors of dusk. Eleanor leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about how it all began?" she asked softly. "All the time," he replied, his hand covering hers. "A supermarket aisle, a can of formula, and now this." He gestured to the girls, to the house glowing with light, to the life they had built. "It proves to me that the smallest acts can change everything." Her eyes filled with quiet tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. "I used to believe my story was only about survival, but now I see it was leading me here all along, to you, to us, to this love." He kissed her forehead gently, holding her closer. "And this love will keep leading us forward. Always." As night fell, lanterns flickered to life in the garden, and the children's laughter echoed against the stars. Eleanor closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the healing warmth of the moment settle inside her. For the first time in her life, the future did not frighten her. It invited her. It stretched wide and bright, promising not perfection, but presence, not ease, but love, not certainty, but faith. And so their story, born from hardship, built on kindness, and strengthened by legacy, became a testament to what love can do when it is allowed to grow. It healed wounds that had once seemed permanent. It turned despair into hope, and hope into a foundation strong enough to carry generations. If you've walked with this story, Let it remind you that kindness matters, that love transforms, that healing is always possible. And if these words touched your heart, if they brought even a little light into your day, I invite you to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and join this journey again. Like, subscribe, and be part of this circle of warmth. Because stories like this are meant to be shared, meant to heal, meant to live on in all of us.